I am Isabella, 29 years old. 3 days ago, my family called to tell me not to come to New Year's Eve. You will just make everyone uncomfortable, my mom said. Her voice was smooth and final, like she was declining a business proposal. So, I spent December 31st alone in my tech loft in Chicago, watching strangers celebrate through my window while my family toasted champagne in their Lake Forest mansion without me. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Do you think family loyalty has a price tag? I'd love to know who's part of our community. The air in my loft was 32 degrees, matching the temperature of my mother's voice. I didn't argue. In the world of high-stakes data architecture, you learn that a no is just a data point. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for years, footing the emotional bill while receiving zero dividends. Karen, I had stopped calling her mom in my head months ago, didn't even wait for a response. She just hung up, satisfied that the discomfort of my presence wouldn't tarnish the aesthetic of her Lake Forest gala. The Lake Forest mansion is a monument to legacy. It has actual marble columns, a foyer that smells like old money and mahogany, and a guest list curated to ensure the merger of power and prestige. Tyler, my older brother, would be there, wearing a designer suit and playing the role of the heir apparent. Charles, my father, would be holding a crystal glass of 18-year-old scotch, nodding at investors as if he understood the complex algorithms that actually kept his company afloat. And then there was me. I was in a West Loop loft, one that smelled like ozone and stale espresso. The blue light from my 6 monitors was the only firework display I needed. My mother thought she was excluding me from a party. I realized she was actually releasing me from a contract I never signed. I looked at the countdown clock on my primary screen. 11:54 p.m., 6 minutes until the fiscal year ended. 6 minutes until the liability of my silence expired. I sat there, fingers hovering over the mechanical keyboard. My heart rate was a steady 60 beats per minute, clinical, precise. This wasn't a breakdown, it was a balance sheet. For 3 years, my compassion had been a luxury they'd overdraft. Every dismissive comment, every uninvited holiday, every time they used my data models and called it Tyler's leadership, it was all recorded in my internal ledger. The strangers outside were screaming, counting down to a fresh start. I was counting down to a systemic restructuring. Karen's voice kept echoing in the silence of my loft. You'll make everyone uncomfortable. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single drop of regret, but there was only clarity. I wasn't going to make them uncomfortable. I was going to make them irrelevant. 12:00 a.m. The digital clock on my primary monitor flashed a neon green that felt like a verdict. I didn't hesitate. My index finger applied exactly 3.5 grams of pressure to the mechanical left-click button. Execute. In that 1 millisecond, 3 years of hidden labor and 1,000-hour work weeks materialized into a global reality. The Sower's Rebellion infrastructure platform went live, triggering the automatic acquisition clauses I'd negotiated in secret with a Silicon Valley consortium months prior. The locked-in valuation scrolled across the bottom of a news ticker on my secondary screen, $4.2 billion. It was a number so large it felt abstract, but the impact was concrete. I sat back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my eyes. I didn't feel joy or relief. I felt the quiet satisfaction of a ledger being balanced. This wasn't a celebration, it was accounting. 12:01 a.m. My phone didn't just ring. It vibrated with a frantic energy that suggested a total system failure. Tyler. I stared at his name for 3 seconds, analyzing the frequency of the ring before I answered. I didn't say hello. I waited for the noise to come to me. Isabella, what the hell did you do? Tyler screamed. His voice was a chaotic mess of static and panic, the sound of a man watching his inheritance evaporate in real time. Dad just saw the news. He is not breathing right. Mom is hysterical. They're saying you released a federal deposition. What did you do? I kept my voice at a steady, low volume. I didn't match his frequency. I released the truth, Tyler. It is a documented data point. You might want to check your email. I just sent a formal non-compete release to the board of directors. Your access to the core cloud infrastructure has been revoked, effective immediately. Behind him, I could hear the Lake Forest Gala imploding, the clink of expensive crystal hitting marble floors, and the shrill notes of Karen's voice. My brother started to stutter, trying to find a legal loophole in a contract I had written myself. "This is defamation," he choked out. "This is a family business. You signed an NDA." "You should have read the fine print," I said, my tone clinical. The NDA covered proprietary information for the family firm. It didn't cover the independent infrastructure I built on my own hardware. The deposition video? That is a matter of federal record now. It shows every attempt you made at corporate espionage. It shows how you sabotaged the government contract to try and force me into a buyout. I listened to his breathing for a moment. It was ragged and inefficient. He wasn't shocked by what he had done. He was shocked that I had stopped playing along. Now I realized our relationship had been a subscription service, and I was done footing the bill. "Isabella, please," he begged, his voice dropping. "We can fix this. Just take down the video. I will give you whatever you want." I looked at the $4.2 billion figure on my screen. "I already have everything I want, Tyler. I have my work. I have my integrity. And as of 12:03 a.m., I have no more liabilities named Townsend." I spent 1,095 days being the architect of a legacy I was never meant to inherit. For 3 years, I was the ghost in the family firm, the one who worked in the shadows of my father's Lake Forest study while Tyler played the visionary. The study always smelled like old paper, cedar, and the heavy silence of expectations. I built the data models, I secured the cloud infrastructure, and I optimized the very algorithms that actually kept the company from failing. I was the research and development department they didn't have to report to the Internal Revenue Service. Then came the federal contract, a multi-million-dollar deal that would have secured the firm's relevance for a decade. Tyler was the face of the project, but I was the one who actually wrote the code. Tyler didn't want a successful contract. He wanted leverage over me. He deliberately tripped the data validation scripts 48 hours before the final audit. He corrupted the primary database and then stood in front of Charles and Karen, pointing his finger at my workstation. He claimed my independent methods had compromised the company's integrity, calling it a failure of my professional judgment. The goal wasn't just to blame me. It was to force a buyout of my independent infrastructure platform, the one that is now worth $4.2 billion. They told me the only way to save my reputation was to sign my personal tech over to the family brand. Everything stayed silent for days after that audit, but in my head, their accusations kept echoing. I kept wondering, what did I ever do wrong? People often ask why a person with my skills would stay in such an environment for so long. They don't understand the survivor's invisible chains. It is a prison without bars, a psychological architecture built on duty, and the desperate hope that if you just work a little harder, they will finally see you. Compliance wasn't a choice. It was a survival mechanism. When you are raised as the spare to a golden child, you learn that your value is purely transactional. You become an invisible asset, a resource to be mined rather than a human to be respected. My silence for those 3 years wasn't weakness. It was the time I needed to build a paper trail that Tyler's ego was too large to notice. The cracked photo frame on my father's desk sat exactly where an apology should have been after that audit. But the apology never came. Instead, they uninvited me from the New Year's gala to seal the merger that Tyler's sabotage had made necessary. They thought they were clearing the table of a liability. They didn't realize they were finally cutting the chains that kept me from burning the whole table down. The digital world caught fire within minutes. By 12:30 a.m., the first calculated strike appeared on LinkedIn. It wasn't a frantic post from a broken brother. It was a polished, professional statement from Karen's account, drafted by a crisis management team that must have been on retainer for years. She described my unfortunate mental instability and suggested that my infrastructure release was a desperate cry for attention from a daughter who had always struggled to find her footing. Tyler liked the post immediately. He even added a comment about protecting the family legacy from disgruntled employees. They were attempting a clinical assassination of my character. It was a strategic move designed to spook the institutional investors who were already pouring $4.2 billion into my platform. They wanted the world to believe that the architect was broken, so the architecture would be deemed unreliable. But anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I sat in the blue glow of my monitors, watching the data points of their betrayal organize themselves into a pattern I had seen since childhood. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a physical artifact I had retrieved from the Lake Forest mansion months ago. It was a black leather journal, but not mine. It belonged to Karen. I didn't need to guess why they acted this way, because I was holding the evidence. This wasn't a diary of maternal affection. It was a merit-based ledger. On page 42, dated August 14th, 2008, there was a table. Isabella, loyalty grade C-. Failed to support Tyler in a debate. Tyler, leadership grade A, effectively managed sibling resources. This was the trap of cruel normalization. To an outsider, the idea of grading your children's loyalty like corporate key performance indicators seems like a psychotic break, but in the Lake Forest mansion, it was simply standard operating procedure. They had spent decades normalizing the idea that our family was a high-performance machine, and any part that didn't provide immediate utility was a defect. My mother and father hadn't just prioritized an image. They had built a psychological factory where cruelty was a necessary byproduct of maintaining the golden child's mask. They truly believed that by attacking my mind, they were performing a service to the Townsends. They had normalized the abuse so thoroughly that they were no longer shocked by what they had done to me. They were only shocked that the defective part had suddenly gained the power to shut down the entire assembly line. I stared at the LinkedIn post, the discomfort Karen mentioned now having a $4.2 billion price tag. I didn't post a rebuttal or an emotional plea. I simply opened a new encrypted file and titled it Character Assassination Evidence, Exhibit A. I was looking at the debris of a corporate partnership they called parenting, and for the first time, the loyalty grades meant nothing. I had spent 29 years being measured by their scale. Now, I was the one deciding the value of the Townsends, and the market was crashing. By 2:00 a.m., I had stopped reading the comments on Karen's LinkedIn post. In the world of systems architecture, you don't argue with a glitch. You debug it. I didn't need a New Year's resolution. I needed a hostile takeover. I stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in my bedroom and traded my oversized gray hoodie for a tailored charcoal blazer. The weight of the structured wool felt like armor. I looked at the reflection of the woman who had built an empire from an exile, and I didn't see a daughter. I saw the architect of consequence. The law offices of Julia Vance didn't smell like the mahogany and scotch of Lake Forest. They smelled of cold air conditioning, expensive toner, and the clinical finality of high-stakes litigation. I arrived at 8:00 a.m. Julia had been my roommate during my first year of graduate school. She didn't offer a hug or a platitude. She just set a black leather briefcase on the glass conference table with a cold, metallic click. "I have the discovery files, Isabella," she said. Her voice was a flat line, devoid of sympathy. She had already transitioned into the transactional mindset I had requested. "We aren't just looking at corporate espionage. We are looking at a total lack of structural integrity." I sat down and opened my laptop. My platform valuation had stabilized at $4.2 billion. I was no longer a resource to be mined. I was the mountain. I looked at Julia and delivered the strategy. "I don't want an apology, Julia. I want the debt." Townsend Industries has been overleveraged for a decade. They survived on the myth of Tyler's brilliance. Now that the myth has been deconstructed, the banks are nervous. I spent the next 3 hours signing documents that felt like death warrants. Using the liquidity from my initial public offering, I authorized Julia to execute the final takeover of the family's primary liabilities, notes I had been quietly buying up through shell companies for over a year. By 11:00 a.m., the consolidation was complete. I owned 40% of the commercial debt on the Lake Forest mansion and the primary production facility in Stamford. I wasn't just a sibling they had uninvited from a gala. I was their largest creditor. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a single memory of Charles or Karen that didn't feel like a transaction. I found nothing. Now I realized our entire history had been a series of microloans, with me paying the interest in the form of silence and labor. This wasn't revenge, it was accounting. I was simply calling in the markers. Julia closed her briefcase. The notice of default will be served within the hour, she said. They have 30 days to initiate a repayment plan before we begin the seizure of assets. I stood up, adjusting the sleeves of my blazer. I felt cold, factual, and lethal. The architects in Lake Forest thought they could hide their failures behind marble columns and LinkedIn posts. They didn't realize that the ghost they had erased was the only one who knew where the foundation was cracked. I walked out of the office and into the Chicago winter. The air was sharp, but for the first time in 29 years, I could breathe perfectly. The air in my Chicago tech loft felt thin as the encrypted discovery file from Julia finally finished downloading. This was the lethal discovery, the precise moment where the criminal twist elevates a family dispute into a federal felony. Every revelation was filtered through a cold, clinical lens of absolute clarity. Julia had been digging through the offshore cloud accounts Tyler thought he had secured, and what she found wasn't just incompetence. It was a systematic corporate espionage campaign against our own father. Tyler hadn't just been groomed for the legacy. He had been actively sabotaging it to ensure its collapse was on his terms. The documents showed that for the last 18 months, my brother had been selling our family firm's core data and platform architecture to our biggest global competitor. His plan was to bankrupt Charles through a series of fraudulent transactions the moment my new infrastructure tech was absorbed by the family brand. He wasn't the golden child protecting the empire. He was the predator inside the gates. Then I saw the kill shot, the evidence that removed any remaining path to his redemption. Julia highlighted a specific series of wire transfers from our late grandmother's trust account, a total withdrawal of $40 million. The money had been funneled through a shell company in the Cayman Islands, but the symbolic object that froze my heart wasn't the money. It was the signature. It was mine. A perfect, clinical forgery of my own hand. I didn't feel the outrage or panic my mother would have expected. I didn't cry and I didn't ask why. Instead, I felt the moment of absolute truth. My brother hadn't just betrayed my work, he had weaponized my identity to fund his own greed. This was the criminal moral severity that justified every systematic action I was about to take in this professional escalation. I sat in the blue glow of my 6 monitors, the smell of ozone and stale coffee fading as the facts took over. I traced the jagged edges of the forged signature with my cursor, realizing that every resentful memory of being treated as the invisible daughter was just a data point leading to this moment. I was the architect who had built the fortress, and Tyler was the man who had tried to sell the keys to our enemies while calling me a worthless burden. I hit the execute key to forward the entire evidence folder to the federal authorities. I wasn't seeking revenge. I was ensuring justice took its natural course. My anger wasn't loud. It was clinical and lethal. Tyler thought he was still playing a game of status and reputation in a Lake Forest ballroom. He didn't realize that I had moved the game to a federal record where his image meant nothing and his actions meant everything. The house of cards wasn't just falling. I was the one who had finally pulled the bottom card. The criminal twist was now a matter of law, and as the clock moved toward 1:00 a.m., I realized that I wasn't uncomfortable anymore. I was finally free. They didn't text first this time. They didn't call to tell me I would make people uncomfortable. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the heavy glass doors of my Chicago boardroom slid open, and the Lake Forest elite entered my world. Karen's perfume, usually a weapon of status that preceded her into every room, smelled like desperation in the filtered air of my tech loft. She was wearing the same black Armani gown from the gala, now wrinkled and ruined by a night of reality. Beside her, Tyler looked diminished, his designer suit hanging off a frame that had lost its posture. He was clutching his antique signet ring, the one he thought symbolized a birthright I had just dismantled. I remained seated. I didn't stand to greet them. I didn't offer them the 18-year-old scotch they were used to. In my boardroom, the only currency was data, and they were bankrupt. Isabella, honey, please, Karen started. Her voice, once smooth as polished marble, was now a jagged mess of shrill notes. We are losing everything. The banks are calling. They're saying you bought our commercial debt. That you are the one foreclosing on the mansion. You can't do this to your own mother. Think of the legacy. I adjusted the sleeve of my charcoal blazer, my movements clinical and precise. I wasn't thinking of the legacy. I was thinking of the balance sheet. I'd been the silent investor in their version of family for 29 years, and I was finally calling in the markers. It wasn't a choice, Mom, I said, my voice a flat line that didn't vibrate with a single drop of empathy. It was a transaction. You uninvited me from the gala to protect the image of a merger that Tyler sabotaged. You gambled the Townsend name on a golden child who was busy selling your core data to your biggest rival. Tyler stepped forward, his face turning a bruised shade of purple. You manipulative little. You set me up. That deposition video is a lie. That signature on the trust account. You probably forged it yourself to frame me. I didn't blink. I simply clicked a button on the walnut conference table, and the primary monitor behind me flared to life. It displayed the side-by-side comparison of the $40 million forgery and the digital logs of his offshore cloud account. I didn't set you up, Tyler. I just stopped being the ghost who cleaned up your glitches, I said, leaning back. I didn't make you uncomfortable, Mom. I made you irrelevant. I slid a thick manila folder across the glass toward them. It wasn't a check for $2,200, and it wasn't a repayment plan. It was a copy of the formal referral I had already sent to the Federal Bureau of Investigation regarding his corporate espionage and the forgery of my identity. Karen collapsed into one of the leather chairs, sobbing into her manicured hands. Charles stood in the doorway, silent, finally looking at me as if seeing a person instead of an asset for the first time in a decade. You have 60 seconds to leave my property before security removes you, I said, my tone lethal and final. The Lake Forest mansion is no longer your fortress. It is an item on my asset list. And you are no longer family. You are just a liability I have finally written off. They filed out silently, the sound of Karen's heels clicking on my floor for the last time. I sat in the sudden, perfect silence of my boardroom, watching the $4.2 billion valuation flicker on my screen. This wasn't a breakdown, it was the ultimate finisher. I didn't watch them drive away. I turned back to the walnut conference table and opened my private cloud. The folder labeled Townsend Industries was a 4-year record of invisible chains and survivor instincts. I didn't feel a pang of nostalgia or the weight of a broken legacy. I hovered over the delete key and applied exactly 3.5 grams of pressure. Removed. Restructured. Restored. People think victory is the sound of an empire collapsing, but that is just the noise of the cleanup phase. True justice is construction. It's the first $10 million of my $4.2 billion valuation to establish the Sowers Trust. It is a kingdom for the invisible architects, a sanctuary for the builders who have been told they are a phase, a disappointment, or a liability. It is a legacy built on equity instead of ego. I watched the first sunrise of the new year from my balcony, the light catching the glass of the West Loop skyline. The Lake Forest mansion was just a line item on a liquidation sheet now, a relic of a contract I never signed. The signet ring Tyler once bragged about was sitting in the trash bin, exactly where his apology should have been. For the first time in 29 years, I didn't belong to a legacy. I belonged to myself. If you've ever been told you're too much or not enough, remember that the world belongs to the builders. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to hear that their integrity is worth more than their inheritance. What would you do with a $4 billion second chance? Tell me in the comments.